Is this working?
No.
Maybe I'm not talking loud enough. Is that better?
No.
We can print it out this size.
Josh is going to help me. Okay, now. Hello, hello, hello. Is that better?
Keep it up.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping things, if I may. First of all, who here has not been here before? Anyone new today? Welcome. That's cool. Be sure, I've asked actually Janice and Josh to help me maintain the email list for distribution. So could you be sure to give your email address to Josh? And
your applications.
I'll get a sheet.
there's a university degree required for, which Charles doesn't have. That's number one. Now, for those who are here not for the first time, how many of you, and this is going to be one of those reverse questions, but I've been sending a few things out this week. First of all, how many of you received something over the last 48 hours?
Did or didn't?
Did. So Neil, Phoebe,
I didn't check my email.
No. Forrest, I put yours on. No, I.
He doesn't know about it, it doesn't exist.
And you did or did not? Okay, let's do this. For those who didn't receive something the last 3 days, will you also give your current and correct email addresses to Josh? I mean, I swear, I have Phoebe's and Carol's and Forrest. I thought, I mean, unless I'm back to smoking that strange stuff again, I remember doing it. That, by the way, was definitely a joke. The suggestion today is to start with, first of all, how many of you did receive Winter is Coming, that very bleak piece? So most of you read it. I thought we'd start with that and just talk a little bit about its key points and follow just a comment or two about the tendency of many of us to, whatever our position is on any issue, rapidly run to the extreme edge. I mentioned to Charles,
I got a sheet. If everybody just wants to put their email on the sheet as they're leaving today, that'll be perfect and help me set up
okay,
everything.
anybody who hasn't been receiving emails,
Want to pass it around?
Yeah.
excellent. And if you've been receiving them regularly, don't bother, just pass it on. But if not, please legibly write. Anyway, we have this tendency to rush to the extreme. If a liberal hears something that a conservative says they don't like, all of a sudden, Adolf Hitler. If a conservative hears something from a liberal that they don't like, the Chinese Communist Party is in the bedroom. That rush to extremes is very difficult. And I think some of this Winter is Coming is just that. Because much of what is forecast there is going to happen. And that's why I want to talk about it. I'm going to go down through the points in the thing, just briefly mention each one, and maybe we can discuss it. And this, I hope you've read it, because I'm not going to read it out loud. We don't know who wrote it. A Special Forces veteran is forecasting a very dismal future as a result of the recent election. In the short term, he or she forecasts that the first thing to happen is we're going to steamroll statehood for the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico through the approval process. As we've talked about before, if you happen to be a resident of the District of Columbia, an area that has a larger population than 4 or 5 states, and an equal population to several others, you probably think statehood makes a lot of sense. They voted on it. 86% of the district residents said it made sense and that they should be a state. What's the problem? It's definitely going to be Democratic because 75, 80% of Washington, D.C. is black, and they preponderantly vote with the Democrats. It would be silly for Democrats to say, oh, that's not guaranteed. It's guaranteed. It's going to happen. If the D.C. becomes a state, that's 2 more Senate votes for the Democrats. What is required to make it a state? And the answer to that question has something to do with whether that's a realistic possibility. There is a faint hope that it could happen. In 2020, the House did approve a statehood resolution for the D.C. The next steps would be for the Senate to approve it, unlikely unless the filibuster is removed. We'll come back to that in a second. If the filibuster is eliminated, or if 17 senators agree to it, 60 senators in total, then the District of Columbia will become a state. They've already approved the Constitution. They've already had their election. It's going to happen. Is it? Will 16 senators join that, Republican senators join to vote for statehood? It's obvious that they won't. So then comes the question, will the Democrats choose? They can't do it through a budgetary resolution. It's hardly a budgetary measure. Will the Democrats remove the filibuster on many things, and by doing so, allow a D.C. vote? That's a topic worth a lot of discussion because it's very likely. I think, and by the way, I join with the senator from West Virginia, Democrat, and not being wild about that idea. I think the idea of ready, aim, shoot is a lot better than shoot, ready, aim. And without the filibuster, there's going to be some of that, I fear. However, assume for a moment that the Democrats do eliminate the filibuster and the Senate does approve D.C. statehood, it's guaranteed that attorneys general from several states will say, we want to take this to court. And then you go back to, well, what about a 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justice Supreme Court? So it's unlikely, in my view, that D.C. statehood will happen. Puerto Rico is even less likely. So that first winter is coming thing, in my view at least, is a fear that's not fully justified. Any comments or observations about that? The second short-term thing is that the media will shift from, I'm sorry?
Did you ask for comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry, please. But wait a minute, Roseanne and Sally Ann are both in possession of microphones. They've asked that you let them hold the mic up to your mouth so that it's easier to keep it clean.
Do you want to explain what's coming around?
In a minute. Okay. Charles?
Yeah. All right. First of all, I think it's an incredible list, whoever put it together. I think it capsulizes a lot of the things that are talked about in 1 page or 2 pages, which is very good. In terms of what will it happen or not, I don't think the Democratic Party would want to go to the extreme by putting this out there in front, the first thing. And I think it would, does this list make you angry, make you fearful, make you indifferent? Those are the kind of questions I ask myself. So I think it's a great risk for the Democratic Party to put this in front.
I agree.
I don't see it that way.
I'm sorry? Neil, Roseanne? You may want to turn it off before you clean it, just so the rub isn't so loud.
Well, I have a couple of comments I'd like to make which have really nothing to do with the existing situation you were talking about.
One of my professors
I
was saying.
noted that the number of deaths in World War II were 405,000 in a 5-year war. 405,000 killed in the World War II. I also noticed at the same time the number of deaths from coronavirus went past 400,000 and is now running at 1,000 deaths a day. So that was another battlefield. And we are losing that battle under the former commander-in-chief.
One of my professors in college used to say when I would preface my comments with, "This has nothing to do with what you're talking about." Well, I won't go there. I think that's important, Neil, to talk about that, but I'd like to just stick with this winter is coming thing for a second.
I'm not finished.
Oh, okay.
I also draw your attention to the number of pardons of the Rogues Gallery that he has issued in the
Another
last
point that's
few days.
directly related to this.
And the worst one was pardoning Bannon twice.
Move on, Peter.
I think I'm being told to shut up.
Well, no, we'll come, those are good points, but let's finish this winter is coming memo first.
Shut up.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but not right now. The second comment in winter is coming was about the media being totally in the hands of the left. And the real gist of that comment was, and as such, it will ignore, and I read, Hunter Biden's porn and payments to the big guy, being President Biden. You know, those are both parts of at least well, I guess maybe both of them will be parts of an investigation into Hunter Biden. That investigation is going to go forward under the Democrats. And by the way, any attempt by the Democrats, the Attorney General or anybody else in the Democratic cabinet to divert that investigation, to stop it or hinder it in any way, I think will be looked upon very badly. I personally would be very much opposed to that, even though I seriously question whether Hunter Biden's been distributing child porn, and I certainly question whether there was a promised many-million-dollar payment to Joe Biden. That said, let's run it to ground, full stop, and any effort to impede that investigation would be a mistake.
It's already been impeded.
How they impeded it for us?
I didn't say the Democrats have impeded it, their lackeys in the social media have done that. They buried the story prior to the election. They didn't give it any publicity at all. And it's a serious story in multiple countries.
I mean, I acknowledge that.
Do you acknowledge they buried it?
The fact that you know about it and I know about it means it wasn't well buried. I'll say that. Does that make any sense?
I think both of us dig a little deeper than some people.
That's certainly true, and they're done.
Okay.
But I do think that there is definitely such a thing as media bias. As I've tried several times to say here, and it's my effort now to be as balanced as I can on both the media I watch and the media I read. Let's be honest about where the bulk of the media is. Fox's viewership exceeds the combined viewership of MSNBC and CNN.
They're worthless.
And the new right position is that Fox is a left-wing cabal.
It's more liberal than it was.
Certainly it's more liberal than it was. And some might say it's an attempt to be accurate. That was a shot for us. But let's be clear. The stories of the Hunter Biden nefarious deeds did receive a good deal of attention during the efforts to impeach Trump. I mean, that was one of the accusations. And that effort to impeach Trump died a very real death in the Senate. So, again, not saying it's been run to ground, I think an investigation is appropriate, and Democrats' efforts to stop it would only make it worse. And I agree, to the extent the media has chosen to bury it, thank God doesn't change what the law does, the legal efforts to find out about it, and if there's any truth to it, to run it to ground, or to prosecute. But I think we have to acknowledge what we see and hear in the media is largely a function of what we want to see and hear in the media. Those who are inclined one way will see and hear much more of that direction than the other, if that makes any sense. I want to move on, but it's a fair point. And in winter is coming, the forecast that this is just going to overwhelm us is part of that awful winter. The third point has to do with a thing called the Media Literacy Commission. How many of you here know what that is, or have heard that term before?
Media what?
It's called the Media Literacy Commission, and it's something that AOC at one time embraced or gave a speech supporting. The Media Literary Commission, I'm going to tell you something, I didn't know any of this until I read this letter and then tried to research and find out what it was. The Media Literacy Commission, Literacy Commission, originated in the European Union, and they have actually passed a law and created a media literacy, pardon me, not literary, literacy commission, which works to, in their words, identify different types of media and understand the messages they're sending. All media shares one thing. Someone created it, and it was created for a reason. Understanding that reason is the basis of media literacy. So now, some will say that anything the EU does is a very, if they're doing it there, that's a very clear reason for us not to do it here. I take the view that we should look at everything as openly as we can. If it makes sense to describe media for the positions it takes and the people who create it, make it clear who they are and some of their background, I like that. I think that transparency is positive. Left and right. We should know when a Kami Pinko writes an article just as much as we should know when somebody very far in the right wing writes an article. That makes us a better educated reader or watcher. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. Do we need a government commission to enforce that? I'm not there. But that idea of a media, if it takes the form of stifling views, of, come on, what's the word I'm looking for? Of censorship, it's absolutely the wrong thing. And the danger is that one man's literacy is another man's censorship. So we have to be careful about it being governmental. But I'd love one to make it easier for us to know what we're reading and who wrote it. You know, yeah.
I object to that because I hate to brandish, I object to that because I hate to brandish an individual who might have a more panoramic view of the situation with a label that makes everything they say suspect.
But when you say you object to that, you fear that by having some panel say he's left or he's right,
Yes.
we've already labeled him in such a way that it weakens what they say. I agree with that. However, I mean, we could conceivably have a label called fair, and everybody would object to it.
When is fair, fair.
What's that, the origin of a thing called a mugwump?
Good luck with that.
I agree. Do you all know the origin of that? A mugwump is a person or a congressman or a journalist who has his mug on one side of the fence and his wump on the other.
An example of this is Bret Stephens, who starts every article by saying, I am a lifelong Republican.
Yeah.
And yet his views are very, very liberal in terms of the the previous administration.
And yet if you look at his editorials over the last year, His issue, for example, on life, right to life, hasn't changed a bit. He's just as strongly conservative. And he has other conservative positions. But I love it that he identifies what he's writing as and his background as X or Y. I like that. But it would be
Left to right, or middle?
kind of a mugwump. No, I think he's a conservative who wants to write things as he sees them, and there are occasionally liberals who identify themselves as a liberal and support positions that would ordinarily not be supported by Democrats. So that's the subject of media literacy. The fourth thing that is talked about is something I find just awful, and that's the concept of a cancel culture. We talked about it, and that was one of the three things I mentioned a week ago. What do we think about cancel culture? Does everybody know what that means or how that's being used today? It's kind of a university term right now, where students at many universities are saying, with respect to certain speakers, whose opinions they with which they don't agree, I want to cancel their appearance or cancel their speech. And the administration of that university is saying, well, if that's what you feel, we will cancel them. So that's where the concept of cancellation comes about. Canceling some speaker. Then you move that forward into what's written or what's on television. Do we cancel certain authors? We're not going to listen. We're not going to allow you to publish what they write. I think that's loathsome.
It's a slippery slope.
It's just such a slippery slope. And I think the very first slip of that slope shouldn't be taken. The idea that when we're at university, particularly at university, we should be hearing as much of all positions as possible, to me only makes sense. Yvonne?
Isn't that what Facebook and all the others did with Donald Trump?
That's actually the next item in this guy's list. And what, Carol?
I was just thinking of a
current day thing of the cancel culture. I listened last night to the young man who owned a computer repair shop that Hunter Biden's supposed computer went to. He has a law degree, and he said that because of what's happened, because he turned it in to the FBI, he has had to close the shop and move out of town because of what was happening to him.
And it's a great example.
Yeah.
And again, it's this tragedy of divisiveness. If a person, I mean, I understood somehow he turned that computer over to Rudy Giuliani, not to the FBI. I would have been happier had it been the FBI. And the fact that it might have gotten to Rudy first makes me question a whole lot of other things. You understand what I'm saying? But the idea that he's going to be run out of business, what kind of a country are we? The next item this guy mentioned, though, is big tech. And we've talked about that a little bit in here. What right do the Facebook, Twitter, Google have to cancel or drop certain opinions or speakers or views of certain people? Do they have that right?
If they're inciting violence, yes. Yes,
One person says, Carol is saying, if they incite violence.
yes.
I would argue that they have a right to do that, but everybody else has a right to not pay any attention to them.
correct.
I would defend their right to do that, but everybody else that doesn't want to listen to their opinion about anything has a right to shut them down.
The short answer is they have every right to do it.
Sure they do.
They're free corporations, and this is a free society. The only way to allow the government to become involved in what they say is regulation. And I use the example of my own industry, which was the electric power industry. In the beginning, let's say the early 19th century, early 20th century really, electric utilities were private companies. And they, making a profit, or seeking to make a profit, would limit their service to people convenient to them. A public utility commission concept was created early in the Roosevelt administration and said, we're going to regulate you. We're going to make a deal with you. You have to serve everybody in this territory, even if they're far away from your generator. And in exchange for that, we give you a monopoly. So the quid pro quo was, we're going to give you market. You have to serve everybody in that market. Regulations have gone further since then. And then, of course, in the 1980s, we tried to roll back those regulations, both with the phone companies and the power companies. But if we regulated the internet, and a big part of me says, if there's anything that's a public good, it's the internet, just as much as transmission lines are. A big part of me says it ought to be a regulated activity. We ought to have access to it, all of us, in certain ways. The downside of regulation is regulation. The minute you regulate it, you give the government the right to say you can or cannot carry X, Y, Z. Does everybody understand that idea? Private companies abhor regulation. Question is it a public activity? Is it a private activity? And I think that's a question we should talk about.
I would argue that private companies
We're try-
don't abhor regulations if they improve their dominance.
That's a very good point. Private companies abhor regulations that lower their profits or their dominance. To the extent that I can, through regulation, control a market, bring it on. Which is, that's capitalism. And a part of that is the answer to why the whole world is richer today or has a higher living standard today than it's ever had. I'll argue that the story of growth is such a key story of some parts of the society getting really, really rich and other parts of the society descending. That's something that's a longer topic than just now. The next thing he talks about is the collapse of borders, which will be caused by the Democrats ending construction of the wall and declaring open borders. Well, that'll never happen, right? Yeah. Except that was the first executive order signed.
Right.
Part of it's already happened. And the question that, how open should the borders be, or will they be? I guarantee you, in a Biden administration, they're going to be more open than they've been. It's just a fact. In another life, I used to be, I still am very much a globalist. I still believe it's a good thing to lower barriers between countries for the movement of money, which is one of our interests as a private company, the movement of people, the movement of ideas. At one time, I would have said, and been proud to say it, I'm a citizen of the world before I'm a citizen of the United States. Part of the last 4 years and the whole concept of America First is to say, but wait, isn't there an obligation, a right or an obligation, to be an American first and to make America first? And doesn't that mean that certain things shouldn't be allowed by Americans of non-Americans? I think that's an area for healthy debate. Roseanne, Charles wants to say something?
This particular question reminds me of the exclamation, "Oh, it's okay, but not in my backyard." And I think here, we're kind of sheltered to a certain degree, protected, which is good. If this were in Texas, the border near Texas or some of the other border states, we might have a different opinion because it may directly affect our livelihood. So where you live has a lot to do with how you think.
Where you sit has something to do with where you stand. I think that's totally true. Well, I think we're going to have to grapple with this issue of immigration more than once. When we first, I think the very first or second meeting of the current events group here in the card room, immigration was the topic. I don't know if you all recall that. I think we'll be talking about it more in the future. It's gonna come back. Yvonne?
I just wish that before making that blanket executive order, President Biden would have listened to the Homeland Security, the Border Patrol that have to enforce our security, rather than just go ahead and make the statement of what they're gonna do.
I think the question of the wall and whether the order was right or wrong, questions of whether the wall itself should have been built and allocated large resources, those are fair and good questions, I think, to talk about. And if it's all right, I'd like to table immigration to make that the subject of a whole meeting, okay? The next thing he warns about is packing the court. And obviously, we've heard talk about, in fact, we talked about it once in here, that with the election of Biden, we're almost certain to expand the Supreme Court by 3 or 4 members, up to 5, to offset the impact of the delay of Merrick Garland and then the rapid appointment of Amy Barrett. Again, while I like to think this was some wild piece, it's highly likely to happen. I personally think we better go slow with that. I'd like to see a few decisions made by the new court. My own belief is that on many things, we're going to find out they're pretty good. And that the hot button issues where they will reflect a conservative bias, there's certainly no unanimity in this country with respect to those issues. Comments on the court packing? The final thing they talk about is ending the Electoral College. Again, as we've talked about in here, that's something that could happen. It's an arduous task, but eliminate the filibuster and it can happen. Which then brings us back to, will they eliminate the filibuster? We may hear about that, we know the answer to that in the next 4 days. If McConnell and Schumer can't reach agreement on power sharing in a 50-50 Senate, the only solution is to eliminate the filibuster. Problem with that is, the senator from West Virginia is not going to vote for it. I don't think any Republican's going to vote for it. So I think it'll come up. I think the only chance it has of succeeding, personally, is if, not now, but down the line, an issue comes up that is so compelling that the West Virginia senator agrees to go with it. And I don't think balance of power in the Senate is a compelling reason. Any thoughts on that? Forrest?
I have one thought. I think Joe Manchin's vote is problematic always.
Yeah.
He's made exception after exception after exception, and he acts like he's in the middle of the road, but he lives on the other side. So that's one thought. The second thought is, I don't think there's a chance in the world they get rid of the filibuster. And I think if McConnell and Schumer want to talk about it in a few days, fine, but it ain't gonna happen.
Well, but it'll be Manchin whose vote won't be there. It'll cause them not to do it, I think. I want to personally thank Forrest, because if I continue to say that senator from West Virginia for much longer, you'd wonder what I know. Let me quickly come to the end of this winter is coming thing. After listing a whole series of other could happen things, which he says will happen, what does he say we should do? And this is where I really am troubled. For those of you who read it to the end, step 1, buy guns, stock up on ammunition, prepare for the war. What a sad thought. What a sad thought. Step 2 could be an ad for certain television shows. Buy gold. Go to hard metals. And then the third would reform election laws to eliminate cheating. We can talk about this a lot. I'm sure we will over the next 4 years. We've been doing a lot of cheating elimination over the last decade. I mean, remember the 2000 election, the hanging chads, and the number of reforms that have been put in place as a result of that. We didn't have paper backup before that. Now, every single state has paper backup. Every single state is doing their damnedest to get registration right. Although Bill Tickle sent me a very good report from Judicial Watch about how registration rolls are still helplessly out of date, need to be updated. But the excess registered voters has not appeared in the voting booth. Nonetheless, we should clean up the rolls. My point being, yes, we should reform election laws, continually looking for cheating, and I hope that's what's happening. Comments? And then finally, he recommends that Republicans and other conservatives become Trojan Democrats. By joining the Democratic Party, they can influence the decisions made there. It's a dismal piece, but I think it's important to read that, in my view, because it is an example of this, radical run to the very edge of a position. And I don't think we should go there. The debate ought to be held as often as possible in that realistic middle. Some bad things for conservatives are certainly going to happen, just as, if you're a Democrat, bad things certainly happened over the last 4 years. A tragedy, I believe, is this first day's executive order signing on both sides. This side, we have 27, I think, by my count, executive orders. Actually, Phoebe and Carol Lee, Xerox, we handed out a list of the executive orders signed to date. Do you have a count on it, Carol Lee?
I think it's 19. Do I have a what?
I thought there were 17 one day and 10 the next.
We don't have the 10. I don't know, I didn't count them.
But the question is, Forrest's comment is, we should have a discussion about what's appropriate for executive action and what requires votes by Congress. I think it's,
17.
yeah, this is the first list of 17. The next day, he signed 10. And I don't know that he hasn't signed some this morning. And if you go back to 4 years ago, something very similar happened. I don't know if that's been the case. I should do that research. Somebody should. Has it happened every first week for a new party in power? I think it's getting worse. I don't know.
It's getting much worse.
Yeah. And that's, try planning, from a corporate standpoint, try planning your business if you know that every 4 years the strategy is going to change 180 degrees. It's just simply impossible. Beyond executive orders and the winter is coming thing, let's go back to Neil's comments about COVID. I think it's an important topic to talk about, and there are several issues there. Just to remind you, Neil brought up the fact that we're at 4,000 plus deaths per day. We're at 400 and some thousand right now, and the forecast of 500,000 deaths by February is almost certain. Good Lord. And the tragedy is, I still have friends, I'm sorry to say, my so-called closest friend, he's not so-called, he's a very good friend, who absolutely denies that these deaths are COVID related. He said he still believes that the only deaths that are reported as COVID are deaths that doctors report that way to get more money. That most of these are deaths from some other cause, falsely called COVID. But I don't believe that.
He hasn't said anything.
I'm sorry?
He hasn't said anything.
That's polite. Phoebe said he has his head in the sand. Forrest?
Does anybody in the room actually know how many deaths of the reported number were actually COVID deaths as opposed to all the other maladies that humans have, including some of those deaths were people that were already in the hospice? I don't understand what the exact number is. I have heard there's a 20% differential for payment for COVID deaths, which would indicate to me that has some merit.
Yeah, are there doctors here?
I don't know the truth of it. I really don't.
Yeah, I've asked our internist, Alice Reed, and she insists that if it's there, she hasn't been collecting. And she knows of no mechanism to get. A suggestion that's been made elsewhere is that there's a bonus, a 20% bonus for a doctor to say, or a hospital, either one, to say the cause of death was COVID. Roseanne Forrest isn't finished.
I'm sorry to talk to you. Well, I know we both have that problem. I feel like that a hospital has a different issue there as opposed to a doctor, because a hospital has to provide incredibly more expensive care for a COVID patient than they do the rest of the population.
But I think that should be linked to the care provided, not to the death or not death. You know, there are gonna be people who live and therefore are not in the death count who cost far more than people who died quickly. Phoebe?
I heard it on NPR that if
Please, it's so hard, none of this is recorded if you speak without a microphone.
sorry.
If you're a patient and you have the COVID symptoms and you come to the hospital and you don't need to be admitted, but you still need some care, you don't get as much payment through the government as you would if you had been admitted to the hospital once you were admitted, and then you go and you get more money. The hospital gets more money if you're admitted. So they are counting the COVID deaths that happen at home.
They are?
Yeah.
Of course they
Of
are.
course they are, because they've already been diagnosed, and they turn them away because they're not terribly sick yet. Sometimes they can't get back to the hospital in time and they die at home.
This goes back to the issue of what's a fact. If somebody asked me, where should you go to find out how many real COVID deaths there are? I'd say, well, the Johns Hopkins count seems to be pretty reasonable, you know? I don't know that they have a dog in the fight of whether it's more or fewer. Otherwise,
Well, I'm talking about rural hospitals, they have very small.
I know what you're saying, but the point is, I personally have seen no evidence that those rural hospitals are making up COVID deaths in order to
No,
receive
they
money.
aren't. No, they aren't. And they aren't getting more money to put them, they don't have room to put everybody in, so they have to turn them
Well,
away.
certainly if they're not,
But they're still counting them. It's not being done because of trying to get more money.
I would think so. The other thing that, I'm sorry, Caroline?
I think it's significant that in the first executive order, which was related to the coronavirus epidemic, that a new person was put in charge, somebody named Zients. Sorry, is that me? Or-
I don't want to, not too close to you.
Okay. Two people who are very important were appointed. One who's in charge of the distribution, for which there is now a plan. There was no plan at all for distribution in the past. And the second person is Dr. Kessler, who is the overall person in charge of everything related to the coronavirus. And these are two new appointments that didn't exist before. And people were very puzzled about where the vaccines were and how they were being distributed. I think you'll see a big change now. And of course, Biden has decreed that there will be 100 million vaccines in the first 100 days.
I'll just comment on something, and Roseanne, I think Charlie has something to say. I think there's reason to question the statement that there was no plan. 18 million people got the shot.
Distribution.
I know, 18 million people got the jab in the arm. And that doesn't happen just by accident.
No.
There was a plan. May not have been the best plan, maybe not have been the plan you or I would adopt, but there was some kind of plan. That's, I would say. And I know the argument is that several people have said, oh, there was nothing there. How did those 18 million people, including all of us, by the way, get that shot? Charles?
Yeah, the distribution is obviously, supposedly a problem. I don't know what the problem is, except that we came out okay on this. Because some of the opinions are, no, everybody get their first shot first, before you get a second shot. Well, I don't believe, that doesn't make sense to me, but that's the way it is. I don't know whether we're making too much of a big deal about this whole thing. World War I, there were over 2 million deaths from the flu. I don't recall reading anything that said it was bad distribution or the plan. It just happened. China thought they had it licked, and now it's come back again. So to me, it looks like, hey, it is what it is. You do what you can do, and then deal with it.
You know, the problem I have with that, Charlie, is well, Neil,
It makes so much sense.
I would like to quote our ex-president, referring to his plan. He said, "Oh, it'll go away like a miracle." That was his plan.
Or drink chloride.
I personally think 500 million or 500,000 deaths is a big deal. While I thought the 2 million dead during the war was not the common flu, I thought it was the Spanish flu. Was that in addition to the Spanish flu?
Whatever happened in 1918.
Now, that was the so-called Spanish flu pandemic, and a lot of people thought that was pretty serious. And I do too. The other side of it, and you know, we can debate this at great length. When this began, and states and localities and the federal government, frankly, began taking steps, and they started really in Europe first, shutting all or parts of the economy down, that meant that this pandemic immediately was something more than just a health crisis. We can debate, and I don't have much of a reason to debate whether it's a health crisis, but the minute the economy suddenly went kaboom, it became much more than health. Then it was an economic crisis. Some of it, I guarantee you, self-inflicted. And part of that self-infliction had to do with not knowing what the hell to do. Do we close down? Do we start up? Do we close everything down or partly down? And I don't think anybody was ill-intended. There was no plan to tank the economy. It's just, oh my Lord, look at all these people dying or sick. What can we do? You get the best minds in the world together and they do what they think is best. And they're bound to make mistakes. And I think looking back on it, we'll say, oh gee, we should have. Shoulda. But we didn't. We are where we are. 500,000 deaths is tantamount to all the wars, certainly exceeds all the wars since World War II. Neil, was it 400,000 deaths in World War II?
Yeah.
So we're really, yeah, we're really getting into a pretty high number of people. And we have to take that seriously. Charles, once more.
There's another way of looking at that number though, and I got on Google it one night and I wanted to know how many deaths were in the U.S. last year. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was about 2.3 million. And in terms of the increase, likely this year, because we didn't have a full year when I looked it up, it was about an 8% increase. So it's not as monumental as it seems when you say 400,000 or 500,000. Of course, if it's your
Yeah.
family, it's very critical to you. But I think looking at it as a public health issue is probably smaller than we thought it was.
I hear that. I would think from a public health standpoint, an 8% variation in a year is a pretty serious public health issue.
But the flu deaths went down because of masking, likely because of masking.
And it's a good point. I think flu deaths, though, we sometimes, I remember during the early parts of this pandemic here, 80,000 flu deaths a year. The more accurate number was in the 15 to 20,000. Yeah, and I've read different numbers too, but that we could, and I welcome anybody, by the way, on any of these points, anybody who wants to do some research on it and find some material. Part of what I hope we adopt as a habit here is to drill down on facts. But what I think is clear is that there are multiple sources of information and they're all biased one way or the other. Find as much information as you can on anything. Just as simple an item as how many deaths we can debate. Well, there's no reason to debate it much long. Let's find some information, find the sources for that information, and try to be educated about it. 2 comments over here. Let's go to Joan first, because Charles has had way too much time. Not as much as Forrest.
I was very interested to look up about the Spanish flu, and I don't have the exact figures, but I believe during the Spanish flu that about 650,000 people died in the United States, with 1/3 of the population that we now have, which means that if we're going to model, we'll probably end up with 2 million deaths.
If it were as serious.
It is this serious, if the vaccine doesn't get put out and if it doesn't work.
A good point, and good to compare it to the size of the population. That makes a lot of sense. Charles now.
Do I have to cede my talking time
You can
to my partner?
I'm singing back to him.
Yeah, okay. One point on the information, and the question is, who do you believe? And is it good, is it bad, is it true, is it false? I think we run into that all the time. I think part of the problem is we arrive at the answer, some of us, we arrive at the answer we want it to be, and then we say, okay, how do we get there?
That's how I
Now
wrote
we-
my thesis.
Oh, then I have to be right.
By the way, Robert's rules don't apply here, it's Bob's. So, Neil. Neil?
I don't think I'll respond to Charlie's comments, but I do have another one. The Spanish flu killed 675,000 people in the country and 50 million worldwide. That was the Spanish flu under Woodrow Wilson.
I hasten to add a Democrat.
Did you say how many years, how long?
No, not in the article I have in front of me.
I'm going to say 3 or 4, Carol Lee, but I'm not sure. I'm going to stop now and ask.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Please.
What I have read, and again, it's all subject to what we read and when we give ourselves permission to stop thinking. Usually it's when, oh, I find some agreement there, I won't think about this anymore. And that's a habit I think maybe it would be good for all of us to break. But what I have read is that most or all pandemics, I'm not sure of the word that was used there, last 2 years, 2 full years.
And the plague is, you probably know, repeated over and over again for almost 100 years. I'm going to stop for a second and ask Phoebe and Carol Lee, we're going to do this 2 or 3 times, to talk about the appointment process for cabinet appointments. Who's been approved, who hasn't been approved, and what the process is going forward.
Why don't we swing our chairs around?
They're going to come up here. Please come up here.
Come over here?
No, come up to the mic, yeah.
Come on, Carol Lee, there's a nice standee for you.
Oh, goody.
Yeah, you stand on that. Come on.
Oh, go ahead, you do yours, I'll do mine.
Oh, we're not gonna do it, it's back and forth.
You've now used half your time.
Oh, gosh. Well, we divided it up, so I'm gonna start with Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, and, you can't hear me? Okay, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, he's being approved by the Senate today. He was the Deputy Secretary of State under Obama. He's been with the Bidens for 20 years. And let's see if there's anything from here. well-versed in the mechanism of diplomacy. So we need him. The second person I did was Attorney General Merrick Garland. As we know, Merrick Garland was passed the House for being the in the Supreme Court, but the Senate refused to vote him. So he's now Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia from 2013 till now. He will face vexing decisions about civil rights and the tax investigations of Hunter Biden. He's a centrist and will restore Justice Department independence. Biden told him, "You will not work for me or my vice president. You will work for the Constitution." Secretary of Agriculture is Tim Vilsack. Tim Vilsack was the governor of Iowa, which is a big farm state. He used to be United States Secretary of Agriculture through 17, and now he's in the Senate from Iowa. He has ties to big agriculture, but he's also done a lot with small farms and especially dairy farms and farmers markets and organic farming. So I think he might be a good middleman for the agricultural. The next one is Secretary of Human Services, Xavier Becerra. He was the Attorney General in California, 2017 till 2020. He took the place of Kamala in that, and then he was U.S. House Chairman of the Democratic Caucus. His parents are Mexican, and he worked his way up, ending with a Juris Doctor from Stanford Law School. I think he'd be good. Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, was the governor of Michigan, focused on incentives to make electric cars and supported renewable energy projects. She tied environment to creating jobs. Pennsylvania is a little edgy, as they are a big producer of coal and gas. Veteran Affairs, Dennis McDonough from Minnesota. He was White House Chief of Staff under Obama, Deputy National Secretary and Advisor to Obama. He went to St. John's University, Georgetown, and he has Irish grandparents. Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security under Obama. He's from Louisiana. Counselor and a litigator for companies facing significant and sensitive matters. He worked in government for 30 years, and U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's a specialist in Ebola and Zika infections. He's a respected Latino by all the lawyers in the country. Cabinet level appointments. The cabinet level does not have to be voted on in the Senate. These are just appointments by the president, and they can be invited.
Because of time, could we go to the Curly do hers?
Oh, and then we'll do cabinet level later.
Yeah, those that are cabinet, that don't require Senate approval have presumably been appointed, they're done.
They're done,
Yeah.
yeah.
The question is, who are those yet to be approved? So
Okay, just
you-
the cabinet you want. But these people are gonna be cabinet level, they'll even be on cabinet meetings.
But if they don't require Senate approval,
You don't care.
we'll talk about them later, okay?
Okay,
Carolee, you
Carolee,
have some Senate
you're on.
approval things?
The wires here.
can you get up?
Yes, thank you.
Ah, here you go. Sorry. It's crashing. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. The
only person who has been approved so far is Avril Haines, who will be, let me find my information here. Avril Haines is also among the youngest. I kind of did a survey of age in this cabinet, and of course Pete Buttigieg is the very youngest at 38. There are two people in their 40s. The rest are 50s and up, which I thought was interesting. Avril Haines is the new Director of National Intelligence. And she is the only person, as I said, who was confirmed. She is the first woman in this position. She had 23 years in the Foreign Service, so she's very experienced. And she was the Deputy of National Intelligence as well, the Deputy Director of National Intelligence. The other two people who are expected to be confirmed today are Lloyd Austin, and he had a problem because he, you were supposed to have retired. Is that making a lot of noise?
I think you're okay.
Okay. Sorry. He only retired in 2016, and you are supposed to have retired at least 7 years before.
Stand up straight, don't lean into the mic.
What is it? What am I doing?
Nothing, fine,
Is that okay now?
fine.
So I was too close to it. Okay. The Lloyd Austin spent many years in the service, and he has been approved by the Armed Services Committee with a waiver that he can perform, and he is expected to be approved today by the Senate. And he is, as you all probably know, he served many years in the Armed Forces and was nominated to be Secretary of Defense. And this has caused some controversy because originally this was supposed to be a civilian position. And so that's why there's been a little bit of difficulty. He's the second person who comes from the military. And it's supposed to be a balanced position and be a civilian. And therefore, there was some controversy in the Senate about this. The other person, sorry, who is to be approved today, I believe, is Janet Yellen. I think everybody's pretty familiar with Janet Yellen. She is nominated to be Secretary of the Treasury. And she has led all three economic agencies, which is very unusual if she becomes, which she is expected to be, a Secretary of the Treasury. She has led the Treasury, and she has led, excuse me, I can't see my writing, can't see my own writing, finance. She was a chair of the Fed as well. So this is very unusual. And what did we say? I think that's everybody who's to be approved today, right? One of the things I found, just for a moment, that's interesting is though this group is very diverse, it is still 72% white and 73% male. The staffers, there are 100 plus staffers, and they are 60% women, 50% of color altogether, and 20% first-generation Americans. So I thought that was kind of interesting because they keep talking about how diverse this cabinet is, but it still has some way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Both of you. And we'll get further updates as more improvements are made. Part of the reason that the Senate is not yet organized, 50-50 Senate, they can't name committee chairman, and this prospect of a filibuster change looms, is this question of appointments. For most of the recent presidents, including Trump, the night of the inauguration, more than 7 cabinet appointments had already been approved. So they were able to start their governments the next day, literally. For Avril Haines to be the only one approved thus far has already created some problems. Acting officials inside those departments have been asked to temporarily chair the departments. It's not the end of the world, but it's not the way we'd like to see it happen. I think literally watch it closely over the next few days. By the time we meet again, I'm certain the Senate governance thing will be resolved one way or the other, and either we're going to be seeing a whole host of these appointments approved, or winter will be coming. Thank you all.
What's our homework for next week?
Homework for next week. Let me ask a favor of all of you. Bill Tickle has been very kind to send me material from Judicial Watch and Epic Times. Bill Ross called me last night with a couple of suggestions. I really appreciate that. Any of you who have things that you'd like to talk about, just email me a note. If you've done some research, good. And we'll add that to the agenda. My sense of what to talk about next week is really what is happening in this first week of the administration. And I'll even compare it to the list of winter is coming. Is what was forecast in doom and gloom way what's occurring? All right?
Very good.
Thank you all very much.
There was a sheet going around for email and
Again,
everything.
the sheet
right
with
there.
email addresses.
It's yours, you can
No,
have it.
that's not it.
This is what you.
Sal, do you have it? How many names are on it?
Anybody ever move it around?
So there are 4 names on that list. If your name is not on the list, that's a little bit like asking anybody that's not here now, just leave your name. Thank you. Bye.
My concern, although it's an answer I'm taking today, what went on with the planning for the election? There had to be years and people involved because they texted pictures in the town of the with the trade, so the people.
So Carol,
And not only that, but they were all equipped.
what did you think of that last
Full
night?
bars and things that the guy.
But you don't bring the rallies.
Overnight.
We'll know more of this next week, in the weeks to come. It's kind of a cool hat.
I think we did the right thing. I mean, what do you Right, and he said, nobody really knows where he is. It's not a situation where he's moved. It'll be interesting to see what he has to say tonight. Hey, morning. Hi there, cutie.
What?
Hi there, cutie.
Talking to her.
No, you. I'm talking to both.
Is that a raincoat?
Yes, it is.
I love that.
I've had it so long, but I can't give it up because it actually sheds water.
All right.
No, that looks like a tablecloth. It looks like the French. Yeah, right. That's somebody's list that was.
This weighs a ton.
What?
I said, this weighs a ton.
Oh, I know, yeah. Oh, it does.
By the time I put it on, I'm on the floor.
Would you like help putting it on?
Yeah.
Okay, I can do that. Just wait. I'm coming.
Where am I? That's what I couldn't find.
Now, what do you do now? And then come back. And then I'll come back and follow you.
If your mouth is
Very close to point.
Oh, what might be yours, did you start the email list? It's not mine personally. It's terrible.
She just cut it, and I think
Same thing here. Don't turn it off. I need this one off.
so we can get together when you wanna get together. Well, how about having lunch with me after your surgery? Can you wait that long?